The Story of Dead Souls. Chapter 1, Whispers of the Forgotten. In the small town of Ravens Hollow, shadows clung to every corner, and silence was more common than sound. Long forgotten by the outside world, it was a place where time seemed to stop, where memories lingered in the air like whispers. The town streets were paved with cracked cobblestone, and the remnants of once vibrant houses stood like haunted relics of the past. Most people left, and those who remained never talked about why they stayed. At the heart of this decaying town stood an ancient mansion, the Blackwood Estate. Its towering, blackened walls, adorned with twisted ironwork and shattered windows, overlooked the town like a rotting monument. For as long as anyone could remember, rumors circulated about the house. Stories of those who dared enter its gates never returned the same. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows late at night and disembodied voices calling out to anyone brave enough to listen. No one had lived in the house for decades, yet every year, on the night of the winter solstice, the iron gates would creak open on their own, as if beckoning someone inside. Most ignored it, fearing the curse that seemed to hang over the mansion, but not everyone could resist the pull. Jasper Delaney was one of them. He was a young man, desperate for answers to the question that had plagued him for years: what had happened to his brother? 5 years ago, on that fateful winter solstice, his older brother Matthew had disappeared without a trace. The last place he had been seen was near the Blackwood Estate, and the town had quietly accepted that he was gone, swallowed by whatever darkness lay inside. But Jasper couldn't let go. Each year, as the solstice approached, he felt an unnatural pull toward the mansion. He could feel the house calling him, whispering his name in the dead of night. It was as if something in the house wanted him there, something ancient, something malevolent. And this year, he had finally decided he would answer its call. The night of the solstice arrived with an eerie calm. The sky was devoid of stars, and a thick fog crept through the streets of Ravens Hollow like ghostly fingers. The town's few remaining inhabitants locked themselves indoors, lighting candles and whispering prayers to ward off the spirits they believed lurked in the shadows. But Jasper was undeterred. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of determination, he made his way to the Blackwood Estate. The iron gates stood before him, open as if waiting. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and Jasper felt a chill run down his spine as he stepped through. The overgrown garden was filled with twisted, blackened trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As he approached the front door, a sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a faint, mournful wail. Jasper hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. But then he thought of Matthew, of how much his brother had meant to him, and steeled himself. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior of the mansion was just as decayed as the outside. Dust-covered furniture lay in disarray, and cobwebs hung from every corner. The air was stale, and the only sound was the creaking of the floorboards beneath Jasper's feet. He shone his flashlight around the room, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. As he moved deeper into the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, he would catch movement out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of shadow or the glint of something in the darkness. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. But as he moved through the house, they grew louder, more insistent. Voices, too many to count, filled the air, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. They seemed to come from the walls, the floors, the very air around him. Jasper tried to ignore them, focusing on his mission. He climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, where he knew Matthew had last been seen. The whispers grew louder with every step, until they became a cacophony of sound, pressing in on him from all sides. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging Jasper into darkness. For a moment, panic gripped him. He stood frozen, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the whispers seemed to grow even louder, now interspersed with faint laughter. And then, from the darkness, he heard it, a voice, clear and distinct, calling his name. Jasper. It was Matthew's voice. Chapter 2, The Lost and the Damned. Jasper's heart raced, his throat tight with a mixture of fear and hope. It couldn't be real, it had to be his mind playing tricks on him. But the voice was unmistakable, and it called out again, this time louder, more insistent. "Jasper, help me." He fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against his palm until the beam flickered back to life. The light illuminated the long, narrow hallway before him, its walls lined with faded portraits of grim-faced figures. At the far end of the hall was a door, half open, and beyond it, darkness. The voice came again, this time from behind the door. "Please. Jasper." Without thinking, Jasper ran toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He pushed it open and found himself in what appeared to be a bedroom, though time had not been kind to it. The wallpaper peeled from the walls in long strips, and the furniture lay in shattered pieces on the floor. But that wasn't what drew his attention. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was Matthew. Or at least, it looked like him. He stood with his back to Jasper, dressed in the same clothes he had worn the night he disappeared. But there was something wrong. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as though he were a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Matthew?" Jasper's voice trembled as he stepped forward, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The figure slowly turned to face him, and Jasper felt a wave of cold wash over him. Matthew's face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were empty. Dark, hollow pits where his eyes should have been. "Jasper." The voice that came from Matthew's lips was not his own. It was deeper, distorted, like a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come here." Fear gripped Jasper, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the horrific sight before him. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You need to leave, Jasper. Leave before it's too late." Jasper's mind raced, but he couldn't make sense of what was happening. "What are you talking about? What happened to you? Where have you been?" The figure stopped, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as it regarded him. "I'm not your brother. Not anymore. This house, it takes us. It keeps us. You need to go before it claims you too." Jasper felt his legs weaken, the weight of the words pressing down on him. "But I came here to find you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure, Matthew, or whatever he had become, reached out a hand, the skin pale and translucent. "It's too late for me. But you still have a chance. Leave this place, Jasper. Leave and never come back." Jasper's heart ached, the pain of loss mixing with the terror of what he was seeing. But before he could respond, the room around him began to change. The walls twisted and warped, the air growing thick with an oppressive darkness. The whispers returned, louder than before, and Jasper could feel the weight of countless eyes watching him from the shadows. And then, in an instant, Matthew was gone. The room was empty, save for the broken furniture and the cold, oppressive air that pressed in from all sides. Jasper stood frozen, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he just seen? What had happened to his brother? But there was no time to think. The house seemed to come alive around him, the very walls closing in, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. He had to get out. He had to escape. Jasper turned and ran, his flashlight flickering as he stumbled through the darkened halls. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step, until they were a deafening roar in his ears. He could feel the darkness closing in, could feel the cold, grasping hands reaching for him from the shadows. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, just as he reached the front door, the whispers stopped. Silence fell over the house like a suffocating blanket, and for a moment, Jasper thought he had escaped. But as he reached for the door, something grabbed his arm, a cold, unseen hand that held him in place. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered in his ear. "You belong to us now." Chapter 3, Shadows of the Past. Jasper awoke in darkness. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he had gotten there. His mind was foggy, his thoughts slow and jumbled. But then it all came flooding back: the mansion, Matthew, the whispers, the fear. He sat up, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He was no longer in the mansion's entry hall. Instead, he found himself in a small, windowless room. The air was cold and damp, and the only light came from a single, flickering candle that sat on the floor in front of him. Jasper's pulse quickened as he realized he was not alone. In the shadows, just beyond the reach of the candlelight, he could see them, figures, pale and gaunt, watching him with hollow eyes. There were at least half a dozen of them, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and pain. And then he recognized them. They were the lost souls of Raven's Hollow, the ones who had disappeared over the years, the ones who had ventured into the Blackwood estate and never returned. Men and women, young and old, all trapped in this dark, forgotten place. And now, so was he. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't coming from the walls or the shadows. They came from the figures themselves, their voices a low, mournful chorus that filled the room with a sense of overwhelming despair. Jasper tried to stand, but his legs were weak, and the weight of the darkness pressed down on him, making it impossible to move. The candle flickered again, and for a moment, the room was plunged into total darkness. And then he heard it. A voice, soft and distant, calling his name. It was Matthew. Story 2. The Lost and the Damned. Jasper slammed the door shut, his heart pounding against his chest as the thing on the other side pounded back. The dull thuds reverberated through the wood, rattling the floor beneath his feet. Whatever it wasn't Matthew. It wasn't even human. The guttural, rasping breaths from the other side of the door sounded like a dying animal, desperate and hungry. For a moment, Jasper just stood there, frozen, trying to comprehend the nightmare he was caught in. He leaned his weight against the door, his hands trembling as he pressed his forehead against the cold wood. The pounding grew more frantic, as if the creature knew it was being denied its prey. It scratched at the door, its nails, long, jagged things, scraping like nails on a chalkboard. But then, suddenly, it stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence once again. Jasper dared not move for several minutes, listening intently for any sign of life, or death, beyond the door. Nothing. Just the hollow, oppressive silence. He allowed himself to breathe, though every inhale tasted of rot and mildew. His legs shook as he pulled away from the door, his mind racing. That thing, it looked like it had once been human. But what had happened to it? Was it someone else trapped in this cursed house, another victim of the horrors within? Jasper couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Blackwood estate had a hunger of its own. He could feel it in the walls, in the way the house seemed to watch him, to follow his every move. I have to keep going, he muttered to himself, trying to suppress the rising panic. I have to find out what happened to Matthew. His grip tightened on the flashlight, though its flickering beam seemed almost useless against the consuming darkness that pressed in from all sides. His eyes fell on the paintings that lined the hallway's walls. Once majestic portraits of stern-faced men and women, the figures now seemed distorted, as though the canvases themselves had decayed along with the house. Their eyes, dull and hollow, followed Jasper's movements, silently judging his intrusion. The whispers began again, soft and almost unintelligible at first, but soon growing louder. Multiple voices murmuring at once, overlapping, their words blurring together in a sinister chorus. Jasper felt a chill crawl up his spine as the voices seemed to beckon him forward. As if pulled by an unseen force, Jasper continued down the hallway, his flashlight flickering with each step. He couldn't tell where the voices were coming from. They seemed to swirl around him, disorienting him. The hall seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and though the door at the far end seemed so close, it remained ever out of reach. Then, the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging Jasper into a silence so complete it made his ears ring. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the voices had been, and Jasper paused, his breath hitching in his throat. It was then that he noticed the door at the end of the hallway was no longer a distant, unreachable goal. It was directly in front of him. He hadn't realized he'd covered the distance so quickly, as if the house had shifted around him. The door stood half open, and beyond it was nothing but darkness. For a moment, Jasper considered turning back, but something compelled him to move forward. His brother's face, twisted and hollow-eyed, flashed in his mind. Matthew was somewhere in this house, and Jasper was determined to find him, no matter the cost. He pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room beyond. It was an enormous chamber, much larger than any room in the mansion had any right to be. Its ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the shadows above. The walls were lined with towering shelves, each filled with books, thousands upon thousands of ancient, leather-bound tomes. A heavy, oppressive air filled the room, thick with the scent of dust and decay. In the center of the room stood a single object, a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was made of dark, twisted wood, carved with grotesque faces that seemed to writhe and shift as Jasper's eyes passed over them. The glass itself was clouded and grimy, reflecting nothing but the dim light of his flashlight. And yet, as Jasper approached, he could feel a strange pull from the mirror, as though something on the other side was calling to him. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the glass. At first, he saw only his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. But then, slowly, the image in the mirror began to change. The reflection warped and twisted, darkening as shadowy figures emerged from the corners of the frame, their faces obscured but their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, fixated on him. Jasper stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat as the figures in the mirror grew clearer. There were dozens of them, no, hundreds, all crammed together in the reflection, their faces twisted in agony. They pressed against the glass as if trying to break free, their hands reaching out, their mouths opening in silent screams. And at the center of them all, his face contorted in pain and terror, was Matthew. "Matthew!" Jasper shouted, rushing toward the mirror. But as he did, the figures seemed to retreat, sinking back into the glass like ink dissolving in water. "Help me!" The voice was faint, almost lost in the oppressive stillness of the room. But Jasper recognized it immediately. It was Matthew's voice, weak and filled with despair. "Matthew!" Jasper cried again, his voice cracking as he reached out to touch the mirror. The glass was cold under his fingertips, and as he pressed his hand against it, he felt a strange sensation, a tingling, like static electricity. The mirror seemed to hum under his touch, as though it were alive. "Please, help me." The voice was clearer now, and Jasper could see Matthew's face once more, pressed against the glass from the inside. His eyes were wide with fear, his mouth moving as he tried to speak, though no sound came. Behind him, the shadowy figures pressed closer, their hands clawing at him, dragging him back into the darkness. Jasper's heart raced as he watched helplessly. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't lose his brother again. Without thinking, he pressed harder against the mirror, desperate to reach through the glass, to pull Matthew back. And then the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 screams echoing all at once. Shards of glass exploded outward, slicing through the air like razors. Jasper stumbled back, shielding his face as the glass rained down around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up, expecting to see the mirror destroyed, the figures inside gone. But the mirror was whole again. The glass was unbroken, and the shadowy figures had vanished. Only Jasper's reflection remained, staring back at him, pale and wide-eyed. The room was silent once more, save for the faint sound of his own ragged breathing. Jasper took a shaky step back, his mind racing. What had just happened? Had he imagined it all? The voices, the figures, Matthew, was any of it real? As he stood there, trying to make sense of the nightmare he found himself in, something cold brushed against his hand. He flinched, looking down to see a piece of paper lying on the floor at his feet. It was yellowed with age, the edges curled and brittle. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up. Scrawled in messy, frantic handwriting were the words. "The mirror is the key. Find the others. Beware the shadows. They hunger for the living." Jasper's heart raced as he read the words over and over. The mirror is the key. But the key to what? And who had written this note? Someone else who had been trapped in this cursed house? Or was it left by one of the souls he had seen in the mirror? He didn't know. But one thing was certain, this house was far more dangerous than he had imagined. And if he wanted to survive, if he wanted to save Matthew, he would need to uncover its secrets before it consumed him. Jasper shoved the note into his pocket, his eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and shift, their edges flickering like flames, and for a moment, he thought he saw something lurking just beyond the reach of the light. He needed to keep moving. The house was alive, and it was watching him. And the longer he stayed in one place, the more dangerous it became. With one last glance at the mirror, Jasper turned and made his way toward the door, his flashlight flickering as he stepped back into the hallway. The whispers had returned. Story 3. Echoes of the Forgotten. Jasper's mind raced as he pressed on, the whispers growing louder with each step he took through the Blackwood Estate's decaying halls. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes and the distant hum of ancient voices. Every instinct told him to turn back, to flee this place of madness and despair. But he couldn't. Not with Matthew's fate hanging in the balance. The house seemed to twist and shift around him, warping reality with every turn. Corridors stretched out endlessly, doors appeared where none had been before, and the floor beneath his feet creaked as though alive, groaning under the burden of untold years of suffering. The Blackwood Estate was more than a house, it was a labyrinth of nightmares, feeding on the souls trapped within its walls. Jasper's breath came in shallow gasps as he clutched the note he had found in the mirror room, its cryptic message burning in his mind. The mirror is the key. Find the others. Beware the shadows. They hunger for the living. But what did it mean? The others, were there more souls trapped here, like Matthew? And the shadows, they were already watching him. He could feel them lurking just beyond the flickering beam of his flashlight, waiting for their chance to strike. Jasper stopped at the entrance of a grand, decrepit ballroom. The once ornate chandeliers hung from the ceiling by rusted chains, their crystal teardrops now dull and coated with dust. The faded, moth-eaten drapes that lined the walls fluttered faintly, though there was no breeze. A cold, unnatural draft seeped through the cracks in the floor, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. But it wasn't the room's decaying grandeur that stopped Jasper in his tracks. It was the figures standing in the center of the ballroom, their backs to him. At first glance, they seemed like statues, unmoving, dressed in elegant, antiquated clothing, their forms stiff and rigid. But something about them was wrong. Their proportions were off, their limbs slightly too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. The longer Jasper stared, the more his skin crawled. They weren't statues. They were people, people who had been dead for a long time. He stepped into the ballroom, his movements slow and deliberate, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The figures didn't move. They stood frozen in place, as though caught in the middle of a long-forgotten waltz. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their hollow eyes stared ahead, unblinking. Jasper's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the figures, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the nearest one. The woman's dress, once a vibrant crimson, was now faded and torn, the fabric stiff with age. As his fingers brushed against her sleeve, the figure shifted slightly, its head turning ever so slowly to face him. Jasper jerked his hand back, his pulse quickening. The woman's face was a mask of death, her skin stretched taut over her skull, her lips cracked and dry, her eyes clouded and empty. But even in death, there was something familiar about her, something that sent a chill down Jasper's spine. He took a step back, his mind racing. Who were these people? Why were they here, trapped in this macabre dance? The whispers in the air grew louder, swirling around him like a storm, their words indistinct but filled with an overwhelming sense of sorrow and despair. Help us. The voices, were clearer now, echoing through the ballroom, filling Jasper's head with a cacophony of pleas. They weren't coming from the walls, or the air. They were coming from the figures. The dead were speaking. Jasper stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight as the figures began to move. Slowly, jerkily, they turned to face him, their hollow eyes locking onto his. Their movements were unnatural, their joints creaking like ancient machinery. One by one, they began to shuffle toward him, their dead hands reaching out, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish. "Help us," the voices whispered again, louder this time, more desperate. "We are lost." Panic surged through Jasper as he backed away, his flashlight flickering wildly. The dead were closing in, their movements slow but relentless. Their bony fingers clawed at the air, reaching for him, pulling him into their cold embrace. "No!" Jasper shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "Stay away!" But they didn't stop. They kept coming, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. Jasper turned and ran, his boots thudding against the rotting floorboards as he fled the ballroom. The whispers followed him, chasing him down the corridor, their words echoing in his mind. "Help us, save us, we are lost." He stumbled through the dark, his mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. He had to get out. He had to find Matthew. But the house was a maze, a shifting, ever-changing prison designed to trap the souls of the damned. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows reaching out with clawed fingers, brushing against his skin, cold as death. Jasper rounded a corner and found himself in a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The whispers had faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of a heartbeat deep within the walls. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the cracked plaster. Ahead of him, a door stood slightly ajar, a faint glow emanating from within. Jasper hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run. But something drew him to the door, something more powerful than fear. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, cramped, and filled with the smell of damp earth. A single, flickering candle sat on a table in the center of the room, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. But it was the figure sitting at the table that caught Jasper's attention. It was a man, old, frail, his skin pale and sickly, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He sat hunched over, his hands trembling as he scribbled furiously on a piece of parchment. His clothes were tattered and filthy, and his hair hung in greasy strands around his gaunt face. Jasper took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. He continued to scribble on the parchment, his hand moving frantically, as though he were racing against time. Jasper stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with dusty, crumbling books. Strange symbols were scrawled across the walls, etched into the wood with a shaky hand. The man finally stopped writing and looked up, his eyes wide and filled with a madness that made Jasper's skin crawl. "You," the man rasped, his voice a dry, cracking whisper. "You're here. It's too late." Jasper's heart raced. "What do you mean? Too late for what?" The man's eyes darted to the door, then back to Jasper. "It's coming. It's always coming. The shadows, they hunger, they never stop." Jasper swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" The man's hand shot out, grabbing Jasper's wrist with surprising strength. His grip was cold, like the touch of a corpse. "You can't leave," the man whispered, his voice trembling. "No one can leave. The house won't let you." Jasper's pulse quickened, his mind racing. "I'm not staying here. I have to find my brother." The man's grip tightened, his eyes wild. "Your brother? He's gone. They took him. Just like they took me. Just like they'll take you." Jasper yanked his arm free, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No. I'm getting him back. I don't care what it takes." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the small room. "You don't understand, do you? This place, it's alive. It feeds on us. On our souls. It won't let you leave. It never lets anyone leave. Jasper backed away, his mind spinning. This was madness. The house wasn't alive. It couldn't be. But then he remembered the whispers, the figures in the ballroom, the way the walls seemed to shift and close in around him. He turned and bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's voice followed him as he ran, his words laced with madness and despair. You can't escape. The house won't let you. Jasper ran down the corridor, the walls closing in, the shadows twisting and writhing as they reached for him. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling his head with their cries. Help us, we are lost. Jasper stumbled through the darkness, his mind a blur of fear and confusion. He had to get out. He had to find Matthew. But the house was a living nightmare, and its hunger was growing. And somewhere, deep within the walls, the shadows were waiting. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.